Welcome board wizards, I'm Blurry Image of Commander Vizardrix, and today we're going to be looking at a new unique deck build that I decided to do. We're going to go with mono white. Now before I get into that too much, I'm not really sure why, but mono white seems to feel guilty and is kind of terrible at everything. And what I mean by that is if we look at the land ramp, mono white is only ever going to ramp if our opponents are playing more lands than us. So to fix this issue, I decided to go all in on the white guilt of having less lands than my opponents and are using certain lands and cards to my advantage to artificially ramp myself, but we'll get into that. The second problem with mono white is that it hates card draw. Either the card draw spells are incredibly expensive or they require that you share, and I don't like to share. So what I decided to do was go with a predominantly artifact draw strategy. The commander for this is going to be Kataki. Now you might say, Vizardrix, how exactly are you going to go with an all artifact draw strategy when your commander hates artifacts? Well, because I think I'm more clever than I actually am and I can't do anything normally. Just ask my wife. First things first, we're going to go over the deck objectives. Now, generally, we're going to try to keep the decks between power level 7 or 8, which is going to last around an hour with a 4-player game. I generally like to keep my decks very unpredictable. I do not use mana rocks with positive mana production, and in this case, we can't really use mana rocks at all because our commander hates fun. I do not use tutors with the exception of lands, and my general goal is to make sure that everybody gets an opportunity to play the game and enjoy the game. Last but not least, the deck needs to be reasonably affordable, all said and done, less than $600. And then I am going to play at least one card minimum that can borrow something of my opponents. It's kind of what I'm known for, and I generally assume that they're going to be playing better cards than myself. Before we get into the deck review, I'm going to go over the pros and cons of the deck. Now, the first thing is that it has very explosive mana. There are multiple games where you are going to have more than 9 mana on turn 6, if not higher. It has incredibly consistent card draw, and it's extremely janky card draw, which is very fun. Your opponents are never going to know exactly what you're doing, but you're going to be doing a lot. The deck is very disruptive. The commander hates mana rocks. And because the commander hates mana rocks, your opponents are going to be playing land, and that's about it. With the exception of green, because green is going to have the time of their lives, they don't care about mana rocks at all. Our win condition in this deck is going to be Eldrazi. Now, I've never seen a mono white Eldrazi deck, and that's because it's a really terrible idea. Green would do this objective about 10 times better than white's going to do. Even a colorless strategy with a ton of mana rocks is going to be able to get the Eldrazi out more consistently and a bit faster. However, it's an extremely fun play style to drop Eldrazi on people's faces when they're expecting angels or tokens. Last but not least, it's a very active playstyle. You're going to be sacrificing lands, sacrificing mana rocks, sacrificing card draw engines, recurring things, and then dropping Eldrazi on people's faces. The deck tends to be very political because of the fact that you're hamstringing everybody else's mana rocks. Most of the time you have the opportunity to make bargains with other players in order to try to create some type of arch enemy type scenario where you're not the one getting punched. As for the cons of the deck, the mana can feel really inconsistent. There are going to be games where you're going to be dropping only a single land. However, everybody else doesn't have access to mana rocks as long as your commander's on the field, so they're going to be land passing as well. While the deck can feel kind of slow to play, it's important to remember that because your commander is awful to your opponents, more so than yourself, it pretty much evens out. The deck has an incredibly high converted mana cost. We have over 19 cards that are 6 or higher in the deck. So nearly 1/5 of the deck is 6 mana or more. And the deck is mono white. That is actually honestly a con because every time I've ever tried to build a mono white deck, every other color just seems to do it better. The deck can struggle versus token decks without trample, and there are only a few cards in the deck that give you access to trample, or without destroying most of your opponent's board states. Annihilator is just not going to get through a token strategy. Okay, moving into the deck itself, we are going to use Moxfield because I'm a hillbilly and I'm bad with computers. So I do apologize for that, but I'm doing the best that I can. Most of our card draw strategy is going to consist of cards similar to Alchemist's Vial. When this card enters the battlefield, you are going to draw a card. Now you do have the opportunity to, say, sacrifice it. There are 2 cards in the deck that do that, and there's going to be Wedding Invitation, which is going to give you the opportunity to make a creature more difficult to block. A little built-in evasion isn't terrible. A vast majority of the rest of our card draw, however, is going to be cards like this, where whenever it goes to the graveyard from the battlefield, you draw a card. The MVPs for this strategy are going to be these 3 here. Archivist of Ogma has flash, and whenever an opponent searches their library, you're going to gain 1 life and draw a card. Jeweled Lotus comes in at number 2. When it enters the battlefield, it's going to draw 3 cards, and then you can tap it and add 3 mana of any color. Now the downside to this card is whenever 1 or more creatures an opponent control attack you and are not blocked, that player draws 3 cards, gains control of Coveted Jewel, and untaps it. In my experience, most people are not going to try to take this card from you because nobody wants to be on the receiving end of Eldrazi. Annihilator is a thing. The absolute MVP of the card draw, however, is going to be Palantir of Orthanc. Or Orthonc. I don't know. Again, I'm a hillbilly. I can barely read as it is. At the beginning of your end step, you'll put an influence counter on it, and then you'll scry 2. Then, target opponent may have you draw a card. If that player doesn't, you will mill X cards, where X is the number of influence counter on Palantir, and that player loses life equal to the total mana value of those cards.
I wish you would.
With a CMC as high as what we have in this deck, any person who elects for you to mill once this card gets 3 or more counters has just elected that they don't want to live in a world without mana rocks. Moving on to the way that we're going to kind of cheat in our mana. Now there are multiple cards in this deck that are going to give us the opportunity to recur as we're sacrificing our lands, basically artificially returning our mana base to a higher amount than what we should have. It's a little bit janky, but I'll explain that as we get farther into the deck. Mainly, though, there are several cards in this deck that are just going to allow us to cheat cast our Eldrazi. An example of those is going to be these 3 here. Now, Aetherworks Marvel says, whenever a permanent you control is put into a graveyard, you get an energy counter. You may pay 6 energy, tapping this card, and look at the top 6 cards of your library. You may cast a card from among them without paying its mana cost, and then put the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. The key word to this is the cast part of that mechanic. Because a lot of our Eldrazi do have cast triggers, such as Ulamog, which is going to enter the battlefield and exile or destroy permanents, the ability to cast here is huge, because we can cheat in Eldrazi without having to pay their absurd mana costs. With the amount of lands and artifacts that we're going to be sacrificing, this thing turns into an absolute engine. Granted, you do have to pay the mana cost for it to keep it around, but that's not a big deal. Wanderer's Crucible is actually my favorite card in this entire deck. For 7 mana, permanents you control have Ward 2. At the beginning of your end step, you will mill 2 cards, then exile a non-land card at random from your graveyard. Copy it, and you may cast the copy without paying its mana cost. Again, the key word here is being cast. We don't care too much about milling ourselves. There are multiple titans in the deck which are going to shuffle our graveyard back into our library, so no big deal. Having access to Ward 2 and another card which cheats out permanents or spells from our graveyard is just an absolute win. Jared's Hourglass Pendant does have flash. I absolutely cannot stand extra turn decks. If you're going to play an extra turn, for me personally, I would rather just scoop it up and get on to the next game, because if you can't win with an extra turn, then you're just wasting my time. But that's just me personally. For 4 mana, you can tap this and then exile it. Return to the battlefield tapped all artifact, creature, enchantment, and land cards in your graveyard that were put there from the battlefield this turn. Again, with how often we sacrifice our own artifacts and how often we're going to be sacrificing our own lands, this is a phenomenal card for cheating all of those back into play. Moving on to the Eldrazi, we do have 11 of them. And I am counting Eldrazi Conscription because it turns basically any creature that we have into an Eldrazi. These are going to be our primary win conditions in the deck. You really don't have to say too much about them. They're Eldrazi. Last but not least here, we are going to look at our guilty lands. Now, the reason I call them guilty lands is because every single one of them is designed to be sacrificed. And because white feels guilty about ramping, that's exactly what we're doing. We are going all in on that white guilt, and we are sacrificing our lands to make ourselves feel better about the fact that we're ramping out of control. Key examples here are going to be cards like Lotus Veil. When it enters the battlefield, sacrifice 2 untapped lands or sacrifice Lotus Veil. This land is going to tap for 3 mana of any one color. Remote Farm, which is going to enter the battlefield with 2 depletion counters on it. You can tap it, remove a single depletion counter from Remote Farm, and then add 2 white mana to your mana pool. When there are no depletion counters left on Remote Farm, you will sacrifice it. And then my favorite of all of the sacrifice lands, Scorched Ruins. When Scorched Ruins comes into play, sacrifice 2 untapped lands or sacrifice Scorched Ruins. Add 4 colorless mana to your mana pool. So you sacrifice 2 to get 4. The 3 best cards for going all in on this ramp strategy of sacrificing our own lands is going to be the card Surveyor's Scope, Weathered Wayfarer, and then cards like Brought Back. Surveyor's Scope is going to tap, exile itself, and then search your library for up to X basic land cards, where X is the number of players who control at least 2 more lands than you. Put those cards onto the battlefield and then shuffle your library. As we sacrifice all of our own lands, and then on the off chance that you're playing against anybody with green, somebody is always going to have more lands than you. So for 2 mana, it is a great card for ramping. Then you can continue to sacrifice more lands so you don't feel guilty about ramping harder than your opponents. Weathered Wayfarer is the absolute MVP of this strategy because for 1 mana and a tap, you can search your library for a land card, and I almost always go for Scorched Ruins first. Reveal it and put it into your hand. Then shuffle your library. Play this ability only if an opponent controls more lands than you. And with the way that we're sacrificing our lands, I promise you they always will. Last, we have a couple different instants and sorceries that we can use. Brought Back is a perfect example. You choose up to 2 target permanent cards in your graveyard that were put there from the battlefield this turn. Return them to the battlefield tapped. We can use those to bring back our artifacts, or the 2 lands that we sacrificed with Lotus Veil or Scorched Ruins come right back into play. So we didn't really lose anything after all. The full list of our guilty ramp cards, we have 5 in total: Archaeomancer's Map, Land Taxed, Scholarship Sponsor, Surveyor's Scope, and Weathered Wayfarer. So we have quite a few ways of tutoring out and searching for those sacrifice lands, or sacrificing our lands and using it to our advantage to find more. And then as always, I do include a way to steal cards from my opponents. Now, the 3 that I picked for this deck is Portal to Phyrexia. When it enters the battlefield, each opponent will sacrifice 3 creatures. And at the beginning of our end step, we'll put a creature card from a graveyard onto the battlefield under our control. It becomes a Phyrexian in addition to its other types. With the number of lands that we're going to have in our hand, because we draw a ton of them, the number of cards that we're going to be sacrificing and then returning to our hand, we will always have the ability to discard at least 1 creature if we so choose. Portal to Phyrexia is a great way to cheat in one of our higher cost Eldrazi, preferably one of the ones that doesn't have the enter the battlefield or cast triggers such as Ulamog, or steal anything from our opponents, which, generally I assume they have better creatures than I do. Maybe not in this case because Eldrazi are broken, but you never know. Sculpting Skill is going to have the ability to enter the battlefield as a copy of any artifact on the battlefield. On the off chance that one of our opponents is playing a good artifact and does decide that they would like to pay to keep it around, we can have one too. And then last but not least is Wandering Archaic. Whenever an opponent casts an instant or sorcery spell, they may pay 2. If they don't, you may copy that spell and then choose new targets for the copy. We do have some cards in the deck that are not really guilty ramp. The MVP of which here is going to be Endless Horizons. When it enters the battlefield, search your library for any number of Plains cards and remove them from the game, then shuffle your library. At the beginning of your upkeep, you may put a card you own removed from the game with Endless Horizons into your hand, basically guaranteeing that we get a land. And I hear you say, but Visardrix, what happens if my opponent blows this up as soon as I play it? And my response to that would be, in most cases, I'm never going to exile more than 10 lands because I don't expect the game to last more than 10 turns once I've got it in play. It's going to artificially thin the deck, so I don't generally care either way if I lose 10 planes. With the amount of card draw that is in this deck, we are going to hit the landfall pretty much regardless. Moving on to recursion, we have 12 sources of recursion in the deck. Moving on to the MVPs of our recursion engines, we have Luminous Broodmoth for 2 and 2 white. Flying creature, 3/4. Whenever a creature you control without flying dies, return it to the battlefield under its owner's control with a flying counter on it. This card is amazing. If our opponents happen to kill one of our Eldrazi, they've now turned it into a flying monstrosity, so we appreciate your assistance to your opponent in our efforts to kill you. The MVP of our recursion engines is Gift of Immortality. For 2 and a white, we get an aura that says, when enchanted creature dies, return that card to the battlefield under its owner's control. Return Gift of Immortality to the battlefield attached to that creature at the beginning of the next end step. Something like Meteor Golem entering the battlefield and destroying a permanent every single turn. Spot removal on a stick is phenomenal. Last but not least, we have the MVP of our recursion engines for artifacts, which is going to be Scrap Trawler. Scrap Trawler is 3 mana for a 3/2, and it says whenever Scrap Trawler or another artifact you control is put into a graveyard from the battlefield, return to your hand target artifact card in your graveyard with lesser mana value. We are going to have to pay the upkeep for this card, but that is not so much of a big deal considering the benefits that we get from it. Moving on to my favorite part of every single deck is going to be the removal. Because I like to play referee, I always have as much removal in a deck as I can reasonably afford. In this deck we have 12 instances of removal, however only 3 of them are instant speed. The MVP of our removal is going to be Path of Exile, Winds of Abandon, Cityscape Leveler. Path of Exile for 1 mana confuses the hell out of me because it should be named Swords to Plowshares. He says is remove target creature from the game. Its controller may search his or her library for a basic land card, put that card onto the battlefield tapped, then shuffle his or her library. Winds of Abandon is a sorcery for 1 and a white. Exile target creature you don't control. For each creature exiled this way, its controller searches their library for a basic land card. Those players put those cards onto the battlefield tapped and then shuffle their libraries. For 2 white and 4 colorless, we have the option of overloading this card, turning it basically into a opponent's only board wipe. Now the reason these 2 cards are the MVPs of the deck is because both of them advance our white guilt strategy when it comes to our lands. However, my favorite removal card in this deck is Cityscape Leveler. For 8 mana, we get an 8/8 artifact creature with trample. When you cast this spell and whenever Cityscape Leveler attacks, destroy up to 1 target non-land permanent. Its controller creates a tapped Power Stone token. My favorite part about this is that in order for our opponents to use that Power Stone token, they would have to pay for it for our commander, as it does only tap for 1 mana. It is essentially adding insult to injury because every time he attacks, we are going to give them an artifact they can't even use. Finally, the deck total does come to around $614.54. Now that is according to Moxfield. However, if you attempt to order the deck from TCG, which is where I get most of my cards, the actual cost of the deck is going to be around $515 to $530. It's varied a few different times that I've attempted. I'm Commander Visitrdrix, thank you for watching, and as always, have an amazing day.